to today's edition of the Human School's Mindshift Cards Conversation, a part of our learning journey here at the Human School. Today, we're going to discuss a question that comes from our Inventor Compass Point. And that question is, sorry, I lost it for a second, is what are some of the advantages to designing alone? So why might someone choose to design alone? So Rachel, I know you had said you'd be interested in sharing first, so go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely prefer designing with other people because I process through talking, obviously. So I definitely prefer it, but there are moments I'll admit I am tech savvy and some people are not. And so it gets tough sometimes when we're creating something together. And then there are some hindrances with people understanding technology or being able to get from thing to thing where I start to get a little flustered and then just have this feeling of like, I'll just do it myself. And then we'll be able to kind of like move forward. And in some ways, that's not a bad thing. Like sometimes it's an advantage to kind of skip the parts that people are stuck on if that's not really the end point. But also it doesn't, I think sometimes I try to be mindful of not making people feel bad for that, because it's not a, it's not a point of pride. It just is a difference. So definitely some of that is the ability to get things done more quickly. But I also recognize that oftentimes, first of all, doing it for them means that I eliminate their ability to learn, which is not fair. And then also that there are tons of places where working with someone else reveals either a friction that I hadn't anticipated because it's easy for me and maybe difficult for someone else. And so then we iterate or we adjust based on maybe what the larger audience needs to do and access, or that their curiosity allows me to discover something or how to do something that I didn't know before. So there are definitely some advantages, but I know I have my moments.
What's interesting about the question is it highlights the value of how we use words and how we structure a question like this. Because I think one of the challenges with the question is that it forces us into a camp of this or this. And I think it's actually both.
Mm-hmm.
And the example that I'll give is I know from teaching higher ed, and I think it's with teaching kids too, younger kids, that if you ask a large group a cold question, you're likely to get like no response. And it's because people are either processing it individually or they're afraid, they're not thinking about the question. They're just thinking about, oh my God, what if I get called on, that sort of thing? Or what if I have to say something and I haven't had a chance to either process it individually or process it with somebody else? And I think that giving people the time to work individually, and I know it's just a question, but you're kind of designing an answer, you're inventing an answer. So having that individual time lets you sort of grease the wheels a little bit, like get into, a framework or start to process some ideas. And then, like Rachel said, let's talk about it with somebody else and then ask that question to the whole group. And there's no problem getting a discussion going. So I think it's a both. You have to have that individual time to like say, okay, let me get my ground. What's this thing that I'm designing, working on, a question I'm answering, and then let me bounce those ideas off of somebody else and let's co-design something else. And then I probably have a better answer than I did when I worked individually. So I think it's a both thing.
Well, I know I kind of relate to Rachel in the sense that there are times where I like the idea part to be collaborative. The doing part, for me, it's giving up control of the quality of whatever it is that we're designing that I can't let go of. So like when I think about the act of design is something that I probably, the idea generation part of it, I'm very comfortable and would much prefer to do with other people. But so I wonder what the barriers are for other people about that very part. Because what you described, Randy, makes complete sense. Like we know that giving people think time and wait time and the ability to process, because everyone does it in different ways, is really, really important. And I mean, from a meeting structure perspective, sit in countless meetings in our line of work, what you described very rarely happens. Oftentimes people are given something cold on the spot and you're supposed to come up with the best possible version of what you can in the 3 seconds you had to process it. And it's probably not a very ideal way to get at complex change either. So
I think what's interesting too is the way that we view the word design, that for me, my brain immediately went to product, right? Whereas I think what you're talking about is also the design of experiences and that sort of work that is more verbal and that is more collaborative, versus the actual creation of a product. And that I wonder too, if that when we talk about design, if there's clearly some assumptions made by what that word
I'd
means
also add
and
that
what it relates
I
to.
wonder about that. There's all kinds of places through the design process as a whole where we it might it might be individual and then group and individual and with others, and so for example, let you do some design work in isolation. After that, have you taken it out to users? Have you taken it out to colleagues? Have you taken those thoughts out to other people to get feedback on? And I think the thing that I think about with this question is, ultimately, we know learning is social, and you can't necessarily learn and grow and get all kinds of perspectives if you're constantly within and of yourself. So I may have a preference to design or work in isolation or on my own, but it'll never be as good as it can be once I've gone out to the users or I've gone out to people who, have expertise, which is, I think, kind of the heart of this particular mind shift is that, yeah, it's okay to design alone, but ultimately it's better when we design with others.
I want to shift to the the piece that you said, Chad, about the creating the product. Like the ideation place was something that was more collaborative, but having control over the actual doing. And I think that that's another thing that if we back up and think of it as not a one or the other kind of thing, but that it's informed by the context that we're in. And so if it's a sort of a high pressure moment where there's a certain time limit and somebody has a particular skill that could get this thing done so that we could all at the same time be off ideating and working on something else, that might be a good choice. But if we don't have the time pressure and it's an opportunity to build community and help people share in the accountability of what that final product is. So sort of taking a long view as well, like maybe if we do go a little bit slower and we make this more collaborative, and yes, it's going to be more messy because people don't quite know exactly what to do, or maybe they need to build a skill or something like that, or there may maybe no more conversation because we're going to shift things a little bit. Still in the long term, that might be the better path. But I think the context is really what should inform that particular decision. And again, I think it goes back to let's not feel like we have to go one way or the other and commit to that. You can have a bit of both.
And to your point, we live in a culture that cares about efficiency. And so the trap that I know that I fall into is there is no such thing as, yes, like it's just a thing to get done and be done, as opposed to the valuing of the community building, which could happen, or the capacity building of the people in the group, right? So it's not always about, I guess what I'm trying to say is I think we fall into the trap of like everything has to be done immediately and it allows us to move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
I'll share another thing that I'll share, which I don't know if it's helpful, but I oftentimes feel the ownership of doing something that maybe others don't want to do as a way to allow them to do more or do things in alignment with their own, right? So sometimes when I think about why I choose to work in isolation, it's a feeling of, well, if I take this thing and I figure it out and I make it work, then it allows other people to focus on their strengths. Now, to Rachel's point, maybe you're robbing people of agency, or there's a whole host of conversations in there, but I do wonder about that part of the conversation as well.
I was also thinking about it in terms of classroom and like experience design. Like I think we're talking about our work at the practitioner level, but at the student level, like there's the same sort of conversation with teachers of, what is the power of co-designing with students as opposed to just designing for them all the time? Or what is the power in group work? Like it's the running joke for kids, right? Like every time they have to do a group assignment, they're like, oh, I have to work with a group, like it's that the importance of that conversation around community building. And, you have the conversations with SEL and career readiness strategies, whether we like that terminology or not, the ability to have conversations and negotiate with people, the ability to learn from one another, all of those things are really powerful. So I think as teachers, not only because it makes us better, but also to model for students what that looks like and to create space for them to have the agency to be co-designers as opposed to just the empty vessel
one thing I'll
mentality
add
too.
About that is, and this is going to be highly critical of educators and not intending to be so, but I think that our vision oftentimes of what that group work looks like is built on a model of school group work. So if you think about the power of project design and some of the design work that we kind of started with, many educators, not all, but many don't actually get to do that. And so their vision of group work and accountability within a group is very school centered and not work. So this is why getting out into the workforce and getting out and seeing what it looks like in an environment where people are doing project management or they're working nuts to bolts. So when we talk about collaboration education, there is a specific way of doing that, which is not necessarily relevant or resonant in the world outside of public school. So to your point, Rachel, designing with kids is really important. It's also, I think, important for us to be designing with our community, because I don't know that as educators, we're the best vessels for that work.
And I'll just wrap it up by saying, I think the importance of not only us having this conversation, but all educators having this conversation is because we get to surface that idea that you just brought up, that when we think about this idea of group work or collaboration in the classroom, we're framing it in a certain way, and our kids are seeing their understanding is being developed around that flawed idea. And so when we say we're going to do this group project, they're like, because it kind of sucks. And it's kind of in the wrong paradigm, so to speak. And I think that these conversations help us as educators see where those flaws are in our own thinking and in our own mindsets.
Yeah, I totally agree. Again, as always, I appreciate the conversation with both you guys. Again, as all good inquiries lead to more curiosity, we hope that as your mind begins to shift, you'll share your thoughts with us on our Facebook group or on our website, thehuman.school. Thanks so much for coming along with us today as part of our mission, which is to place humanity at the center of all design. Bye, guys.